Hello, my name is Peter Vermeersch, Professor of Politics at KU Leuven, and it is my honor to welcome Elisabed Gedevanishvili to the studio today. Elisabed is a researcher and lecturer at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia, and affiliated with the Center for Social and Cultural Research. Elisabed's interests include queer theory, infrastructure and climate change, prefigurative politics. Elisabed works in academic and wider than academic media, mixing visual, written, collaborative and experimental forms. And in the autumn of 2025, Elisabed will embark on a PhD at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. Welcome, Elisabed. In this podcast episode, we'll talk about Georgia, a country that you're not very familiar with, obviously. And specifically, I'd like to talk about the current state of democracy there and the role of gender matters in that context. And the context is the protests we've seen in previous months, last year. And I'd like to start with a very open question. We saw this massive protests, an uprising for democracy, you could call it, against authoritarian tendencies. And these pro-democracy protests were driven in large part by the so-called foreign agent law that focused on non-governmental organizations receiving foreign funding. And so we are now a few months later, and it seems that Georgia's democratic institutions have significantly deteriorated. So I would wonder, what is your view on this? Where are we now in Georgia with relation to the state of democracy?
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to the podcast. It's an honor to be here and to share my own story and share the story of Georgia, its authoritarian tendencies, and the direction that resistance activism and the state is heading towards. To trace back the protests, they started last spring, as you said, with the introduction of the Foreign Agents Law that targeted non-governmental organizations and required them to register in a registry for foreign agents. This led to and sparked large mass protests in the spring. They carried over towards the summer. However, in between summer and June, they halted as we were heading towards parliamentary elections in autumn. Yep. And there was state violence in these protests, instance of tear gas, pepper spray, and use of illegal substances in the said two technologies that still remain to be investigated. And the use of these technologies took a massive toll on activist health, and we're still seeing the repercussions of the said technologies on myself even and people that surround me. And the pause in the summer was for the political parties to start campaigning and offering nuanced programs so that people would be steered in one way or another. Although it's a multi-party system, the Georgian dream that is currently in the government has been in power since 2012. And it's been a slow process where they started to draw the portrait of enemy, and this might be a political party. In this particular case, the enemy of the political party is the party that led Georgia from 2003, from Rose Revolution up until 2012. The party is called the United National Movement, and it has to be remarked that towards the end of their rule, they were also quite authoritarian and quite violent. So the regime change was through democratic elections. Yep. So when you have grounds and histories of repression and violence, it was quite easy for the ruling party to mobilize those ideas around the United National Movement on the one hand, and on the other hand, they've started to use political homophobia and anti-European sentiment to try to divide people over these issues and distance itself from Europe and push forward this idea of sovereignty, which is another form of political technology that is used to actually consolidate authoritarian power. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, one of which is the strong connection between political and economic elites in Georgia, which has plagued our political spectrum since independence. Political parties in the summer of 2024 were not able to campaign successfully. And in October, when parliamentary elections took place, there were instances of electoral fraud. And on the other hand, it was also a failure of these said parties to campaign successfully in the region specifically. Because opposition won the urban centers, particularly Tbilisi, and the ruling party, which is called the Georgian Dream, in a way lifted its hands from campaigning in Tbilisi and really diverted its attention towards the regions, successfully so. And I remember watching TV and seeing the results pop up. People took to the streets after the elections in October, and we've been protesting ever since. In this time since autumn, the Georgian Dream has begun its post-election activities, and they've rolled over many more laws that are consolidating and centralizing power more and more in all branches of the government, be it judicial branch, legislative, and so on and so forth.
So what we see here in 2024 is sort of the emergence of a lot of the recipes that also in other countries politicians with authoritarian ambition seems to employ. Probably they've copied a bit from these other examples. And then it focused on this foreign agent law, which was in a way copied also from Russia. But you seem to say that now, since then, since the gaining of power by these authoritarian politicians, and specifically the Georgian Dream Party, that other pieces of legislation have been put into law. Could you tell a bit about these other pieces of legislation?
So these pieces of legislature, some have been generative, whilst others are repressive. For example, they legislated a stricter version of the foreign agents law, and they've tried to justify it by echoing FARA law, a version of which is in place in the United States. They've also tightened restrictions on protests and the fines on protesters. They've increased the fines and limited space in which one can protest. In a way, they've outlawed for people to express their claims in the streets. And those who have taken to the streets, they've imprisoned.
And so what is the effect of that on the people who've actually protested for many months? Are they now discouraged? Is there an attempt to form a underground movement, or have they left the country? Or could you say something general about the mood, let's say, in these pro-democracy circles?
I think the mood depends on who you're asking and on what day. It fluctuates. There's almost a need on some days to remain positive, even if the situation is quite grim. On worse days, people go out and protest. However, they're open to being vulnerable with each other and bearing in mind that the multiple months that we've been outside protesting, try to search for new avenues in which to protest. However, there's an air of frustration in society because not a lot of things seem to be working. Overall, I wouldn't say that people are discouraged. For example, they found innovative ways to overcome the limits and also...
Such as how?
So the ruling party has implemented high-quality cameras in all streets and outlawed the use of face masks that conceal a person's identity. So people have started to carry around party hats and carnival masks to find a gap in the law. And in other instances, people have defied the law itself and continued to mask themselves to preserve their identity.
Yeah. I want to go a little bit back to something you said earlier in the conversation about the Georgian Dream Party focusing very much on homophobia or using that as a tool for mobilization. It's also something we know from other countries that this is a very useful, it turns out, tool to mobilize populations, specifically non-urban populations and older populations. Could you say something about this specific aspect of the mobilization of the regime there? Is it copy-paste from other countries, or does it have any specific Georgian elements to it? And why do you think it turns out to be such a success formula for these authoritarian politicians?
In essence, how I view authoritarianism is that people in power do need a picture, a frame of an enemy that they can alienate from the society and mobilize the population against them. And due to the rise of Christian orthodoxy since the independence of Georgia, queer people are unfortunately, a very easy target. And it is also unfortunate to say that the ruling party has been quite successful in creating the public enemy out of queer people through legislation, as well as PR campaigns.
Yeah, through money as well, because money is not a problem. We haven't talked about the oligarchic aspect of the politics there, but we can return to that later on. But yeah, so through legislation and through campaigning, enemy formation, let's say.
Yeah. This trend, we've seen it all over Eastern Central Europe as well as Russia. So it is not surprising that those who wanted to stay in power in Georgia try to pull examples and advice from their so-called allies in the wider region. And this has had a very material and physical impact on queer people in Georgia. For example, gender-affirming healthcare has been outlawed, and it has led to a big immigration wave of trans people and non-binary people whose livelihoods depend on gender-affirming care. And even more generally, a lot of my friends have emigrated because of the hatred that they're exposed to in everyday life. It's also a very financial problem where people are facing discrimination now in their workplaces. A lot of activism was projectified in Georgia, so it was dependent, unfortunately, on donor funding. And due to these limitations that are resulting from the Foreign Agents Law and now FARA, people have had limited access to funds. So they've had no other choice but to leave the country looking for better livelihoods. And I have to say that a lot of people that I know have actually come to Belgium as asylum seekers. But they go looking for a better life. However, they face very harsh realities of immigration EU policy on the ground.
Yeah. Now, the irony of the whole matter is, of course, that the Georgian Dream Party is also Eurosceptic and in a way using the pro-human rights values of the EU in order to make a distance between Georgia and the EU and to mobilize these populations. So this is also something puzzling perhaps in other countries in the region. What about the appetite, I suppose, of a lot of people in Georgia to join the EU? Is this not a sufficient counterweight against the Eurosceptic populism that the authoritarian politicians put forward? Could you enlighten us a little bit on that? Yeah.
By most recent studies, people still express their desire to join the EU and continue their European path. However, as Georgia has a very conflicted history of occupation from Russia, and the question of sovereignty is always a very pressing matter, it is easy for the ruling party and the regime to mobilize people for sovereignty and position EU as
potential colonizer.
Potential colonizer, exactly.
Yeah, but if you would look at history, obviously, the Soviet Union and Russia would be the more likely candidate to be branded as a colonizer. But in this particular campaign, it works the opposite way.
The opposite way. And also another issue here at hand is fear of war that the ruling party very successfully mobilizes, especially in non-urban areas where infrastructures of movement are less developed, economy is less developed, and the fear of a war looms over the population.
Now think about the position of Western democracies and the EU and wanting to influence positively some of the pro-democracy activists in Georgia. What would be, well, your advice, I suppose, to them? Because it's a difficult situation, it seems, because if you support directly, you seem to somehow confirm the framing that the Georgian Dream has put forward. But if you do nothing, obviously, then you leave it also to the Georgian Dream Party. So it's a lose-lose situation in that sense. So how can you get out of this conundrum? Also, from the viewpoint of pro-democracy activists in Georgia, what would they want, do you think, from these Western democracies and from the EU?
It's a very difficult question because if we go back to the previous regime from 2003 to 2012, the perspective of EU officials, politicians had a weight on the decisions that the regime made in the end. However, what we see in this case with the Georgian Dream is that no matter what the statement is, it doesn't influence the way of politics. Counter-effectively, it almost confirms what ideas and narratives the Georgian Dream is trying to advance. I don't know, to be honest. I think there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done in these activist spaces of resistance. And somehow the financial aspect needs to be delinked from those processes for them to be more sustainable. But I don't know to what extent that is possible, especially in the economic crisis that we're starting to witness in the country.
Yeah. Important perhaps also is not to forget the pro-democracy tendencies and powers and mobilizations within Georgia, because there's a danger that they would get marginalized and forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Yes, one thing I think for the resistance is to continue on and try to look for new and alternative ways to protest, to also be vulnerable and accept some hard truths that may be difficult to face. But with this ongoing regime and the way they analyze the ongoing processes, it is very important to constantly reinvent oneself, constantly be in motion of resistance.
And keep the spirit of democracy alive in very dire circumstances.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we have to end here. Thank you for the illuminating insights, Elisabed Gedevanishvili. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.